perhaps we can perfectly in time, we can move to a more general discussion. Thank you, Kadambari, but actually you will stay with us because now we will actually expand our conversation. So I would like to invite you, the audience also to put forward questions. I mean, this is actually the concluding session, let's say, of our today's symposium. I have to say that I'm personally extremely happy about the event. The level of the contributions was very high, and I mean, speaking about labor, I think there was a lot of labor of love in what you presented and what you did. And something that I found really a provocation, because I really want to repeat this, and I think this has been, I said this many times, but especially after hearing all the presentations, I feel that today academia is very much actually putting the issue of construction at the very periphery of its discussions. I have to say, even the discussions that often are more committed to raise political and social issues fall short in really addressing the complexity and the very nitty-gritty actually of how architecture is produced. And so I have to say that I've been always thinking, to write this essay about the strange disappearance of building from architectural theory. And of course, building here is not just the building as an object, but building really as a process that involves a vast chain of actors, but also transactions. And I think the diagrams, the very expansive diagrams that Kadambari was showing in her presentation, really start to actually allow us to understand this condition, but also the oral history that was put forward by Christine Wall is also another strategy to break through the monolithic, let's say, appearance of architecture. So I don't know. I think that I'm sure there are still a lot of questions, and I really would like to invite you, all of you, also the speakers, eventually, to put forward some questions which we can then discuss together. Actually, there are still questions made on the chat. The chat apparently is very, it's up and running, but I would really love to, would like to ask to those who are writing their question in the chat to take the digital floor. I mean, again, it's very, I know Zoom might be not the most friendly place to speak to everybody, but please take the virtual floor. Raise your hand or...
Eleonora, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, hi. Where was it? Yes, I'm a second-year student in Switzerland, and I just observe this kind of, I'm surrounded by a lot of people my age that are Zeichner, so they have a vocational training between 14 to 18 years old, which makes them a drawer. And what I observe with what they're doing is they're always drawing the construction details, and they kind of sometimes roll their eyes at some of the architects. The architects always come from higher or graduated from higher education. And in the office, there's just such a clear distinction. And I wanted to know from some of you guys what your experiences with this relationship between drawers and architects. And then another thing is just Philip Mesco made a question about informal settlements that he'll probably explain. And I wanted to add something to it, but I'll do that when he asks. Thank you.
Anyone want to answer?
Just a comment on based on the question and connected to some of the things that Kalambari was mentioning in terms of the architects working for construction companies in Turkey. At least given the very specific location that I'm in and the size of the architecture school that I work with and teach at, which is small, it's 180 students total. Many of our students obviously can't find architectural work, meaning there aren't enough architectural practices eventually, right, to employ all of our students locally because it's a small kind of place. So I think part of that is figuring out how some of these conversations begin to transplant into larger sectors of the construction industry as well, at least for me, because that is primarily the largest group that has the most amount of agency in the place that I live. And I see a lot of our students being able to actually work within that context. And so that's how I would see the kind of distinction. And at least for me, that distinction doesn't come in within school or within classes, at least in the state. It comes within just the education that we're giving them and the opportunities that the market has kind of set for them locally. So I'm hoping that, you know, it's a long kind of project in a way, but I'm hoping that that's the kind of trend that we see a lot more agency within construction field for our students, to be honest.
So there are other people who have raised their hand. Unfortunately, Valerio Glisenti has raised his hand. Valerio Glisenti or Miguel Falci.
I'm here. Oh, thank you so much for the presentations and also for the opportunity to be here and talk to you about it. Actually, mine is a bit more of a comment, right? Because about 13 years ago, I was actually an undergrad student studying architecture in São Paulo. And at that time, it was very interesting because I started my studies really interested in learning how to design. And the first step I took was like trying to understand representation, like drawings and the making of models. And then I moved on to the actual realization of the projects, right? The materialization of the designs. At that time, I was always looking at the AA and also to other practices outside Brazil. And that took me to a master's course in Japan, because I was always like thinking, how did these guys build what they build? You know, how is that possible, right? So I had the chance to spend some time there. And I actually realized that many of the things that were discussed here today are present in the way they organized the architecture world there. So to begin with, for example, the structural engineers that in most countries is part of the engineering schools. In Japan, they come from the architecture schools. So they have a closer connection to architecture. And at the same time, when the drawings of details in Japan, like they are not as important because they usually like work with contractors that are very specialized in these drawings. So some architects, they cannot draw these details. So the contractor is good enough to do that for them. And also, what is interesting is that they managed to keep some of the crafts from the old ages, like, and also one of the biggest construction companies in Japan is actually originated from a carpentry family. It's called Takenaka, right? So basically, what I found it very interesting, and I had the chance to work there in a studio for a few months, was to see that the building of models is such an important part of their making of architecture, right? So for instance, if they had any problems to explain the contractor or the builders how they wanted the design of that special joint, they would build a one-to-one model in form, and then they would have meetings to explain the idea to the builders. So on one hand, you have like these very interesting conversations going on between architects and builders. And on the other hand, you had a very, very tragic problem, which is like the lowest rank builders, they actually were managed by the Yakuza, right? So some of the people who were like signing and telling passersby to keep away from certain parts of the construction sites, they were actually kind of the lowest part of, the worst part of Japanese society. So at one point you have like a very, very skilled labor force, and at the same time you still have this problem where with the low skilled workers. And I just wanted to add that just because Pierre was talking about the role of the drawings, which I think sometimes it can be alienating. And then this idea how to think architecture through models, right? Because they actually are kind of a make do for the impossibility of actually building the real thing. So this is one of my points, and I can say that at the AA I had the chance to go to Hook Park, and that was like a very important experience because you get in touch with the real materials, and you get to build things. And back in São Paulo, we also have a very good workshop, and we have the technicians there. They are really well paid, and then they are there to assist the students, but they were always demanding drawings from us. So the chance to get on hands-on with materials was not actually possible, not at the time that I was studying there. Maybe it changed, but I mean, I just wanted to bring these few things. I know it sounds a little bit random, but I'm sure you can like find something to comment on. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Anyone wants to...
Yeah, I'll just, I mean, thank you for your comments. You know, I think they're fascinating. There are a lot to comment on, but I'll just talk about a couple of things. First of all, I do teach introductory design studios to undergraduate, and right now we are all on Zoom. And so the challenge of, you know, doing models, you're just reminding me of this kind of incredible you know, challenge, and our undergraduate studios are very hands-on. But the other thing I would say that we could also then fall into kind of romanticizing those techniques. I think the challenge is really to now be able to use whatever tools we have available. And I think in that sense, we need to really go between analog and digital. And we really need to teach a way to draw and think with the technologies we have available today and really maximize their potential, you know, and kind of not essentializing or even romanticizing one over the other, but really as we can pick up a pen and we can work on a computer, you know, we can be doing all those things. So one thing, and the other thing I think you bring up, it's fascinating. I really do think we need a kind of an international discussion on architecture education. I think we have a lot to learn from different countries. And within the countries, as these last two comments came, there are these kind of often parallel or different things that coexist. And I think, I do think that there should be a discussion around this kind of reform of kind of architecture education in a way. But in the US, for example, you know, there are two tracks. You can do an architecture major as a part of a liberal arts. That is where I teach. And I was trained on the other side in India with a more, you know, where architecture schools are independent, like the AA, and they are kind of 5-year professional programs. But I do see that there is a kind of an advantage or a discussion to be had in both ends. I think the liberal arts education is really important. It's very critical these days. Architecture, you know, has a lot to learn from, let's say, anthropologists, or, you know, so our students do many other courses in many other disciplines that are traditionally called liberal arts, and I really begin to value those. On the one hand, and then on the other hand, there are also these issues of licensing, etc., that, you know, are then connected to architecture education. But it's a vast topic. But I did want to say that I do think that there's a need from these international contexts around architecture education, to start learning from each other, but perhaps also form different kind of collaborations around that.
Thank you.
Maybe I can say something just for the same desire for precision. Look, Miguel, it's very true what you said, but it's also true that in Japan, the same word actually defines architect, engineers, and building surveyors. So it's exactly the same word. What changes is the degree which is attached to that word. So it already comes from a tradition which is completely integrated. And the other thing I think one should consider is that buildings today are not built from architects' drawings. Architects cannot issue drawings for constructions because they cannot issue warranties on building products. And I guess this is an important thing to realize, because it changes the entire discussion, even about representation. And I'm saying this because I think that it's not simply about building or bringing construction into a theory of architecture, but also getting much closer to the theory of building, because the theory of building is what matters here. So, and around the world, what Kadamba is saying, and she knows how fond I am of her work, but essentially the difference around the world is that we have 80% of unskilled construction workers around the world and 20% skilled workers. And depending on where you go, this percentage changes slightly. But the problem is how you build a building with raw commodities and how you build a building with specialized building systems. Specialized building systems have got skilled labor. Raw commodities, material commodities have got unskilled labor. And so the challenge of the next 20 or 30 years will be how we actually bring together these two systems of construction, particularly consider the evolution, the development of material science that will change how concrete is actually poured and laid out. Okay? And so it seems to me that we have, so in relation to what Christine was saying as well, Agustin, and so I think it's very, very important to, in a sense, delve into the theory and the study of the construction process and construction technology before sort of bringing into the realm of, into the domain of architecture. So this is essentially a plea that I make to everyone, that building is what matters in this moment. Zaha Hadid is right. She has no power over what happens to the workers of her building in the south of the world. She has more power in the north of the world due to the contractual relations that are in place. Okay, so in a sense, we need to move away from an overgeneralization, because God, as this symposium say, is in the details. And it is the details that make all the difference. So for instance, anyway, I'll stop here just to, but, there are a few words of support and caution at the same time.
If I may just say a very short thing. It's concerning the Japanese architecture, right? So before the advent or the tea house, there were like the daikus, the mass carpenters, and then their kind of representation was so basic that they would draw line plans on a piece of wood, and that was the way they would build because everything else was in their heads. So with the tea house, the tea masters came in, and they brought along a very interesting way of designing, which was called okoshiezu, which is a kind of a plan that would fold up. So it was like folding plans. Robert Adams, at the same time in England, he was doing something similar, but with a flat drawing. But it was interesting that they created a kind of communication with the builders that was very, very sophisticated at the time. And what I find it interesting, just what Paolo just said about the need to bring these two worlds together, I think we cannot forget the importance of these sophisticated tools that we developed along the way, like the representations. Yeah, basically that was it that I wanted to say. Thank you so much again.
Paolo, can I respond a bit to Paolo? I think I really appreciate what you just said, but I sort of fear that actually architects don't really have much control in the Northern Territories over labour. And we're witnessing at the moment the evidence of this unfolding in the Grenfell inquiry, which is an absolutely shocking thing to have to witness. The fact that the construction industry has, because of deregulation, there is nobody taking responsibility for decisions that have ended in the most terrible consequences in the fire and 72 deaths. And I think you can trace that back to the way things started to unravel in the 60s in terms of regulations. But so I sort of worry that architects always, they carry a big load. I mean, they want to behave ethically and responsibly, but in effect, it's actually very difficult to do that within a very corrupt construction system.
Well, Christina, this is where I agree with you, you know that, but I also disagree substantively, because I think that in some cases there is connivance, particularly in relation to the episodes that you're describing. But the other thing is that we have a contractual structure within the building industry, which is a notion of differences, which is highly sophisticated in terms of specializing particular and contractual relation, or I'm sorry, relational contracting. And so I think if one wants to exert control over particular processes, one needs to go back and analyze in detail the relations that are actually determined by the contracts that are in place. And that's what actually provides, in a sense, allocates decision-making power to particular sites. So if I can actually go back to your own mentor, so if we consider building as a process that was published, 1972 by Duccio Turi, it was actually this argument that was made very, very clear that there are 4 ways of building a building, of constructing a building, are 4 different social models. They follow a particular type of contractual relations, and each one of them puts responsibility and the onus of making decisions on particular people. So essentially, that's what I'm saying, that if we want to understand why Grenfell took place, one also has to go into the institutional organization that regulates social relations between technical members of that particular industry. That's all.
Yeah, you've got a point. Yeah.
I think one thing to perhaps add to this discussion is then, what is the leverage and what leverage does an architect have or can have or can use? And I'm really talking about, I'm not talking about the informal sector of labor, but the projects that we saw in the Middle East that are really well financed and, the multinational corporations have figured out a way to leverage their power and influence in some places. Architects have agreed to work with them, but often they are some architects, I would say, as often at that front end, is there a small window even before the contracts are drawn up, let's say, to kind of say, well, if architects are important to that process, to sort of use their leverage to formulate certain conditions under which the projects might even begin, or that they might participate. And I do think that that's something, for these big, very well financed project, for a big firm that's doing 50 projects, can we try this for one project, where we could say, well, let's try to do a different kind of a contract. And this is because, this is where I wonder if there's a pressure point, of some sort of ethics that we might appeal to, or think that in general, some architects might think, and I think, myself perhaps as of one that, that if we think of ourselves as somehow trying to change things, reform things, or even be progressive in some way, what is our leverage? And that leverage, I think we do as educators, we are also, I would say, at the front end. We are educating young architects, many in their first studios. How do we make them understand these very large, complex processes in a way that they feel that they can play a role, a social role, a political role, or maybe even, one day feel like they have some agency or some political agency to somehow work with these issues.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think of course there is also a problem of how the relationship between architecture and the labor, of course, of design, but also the labor of building is something that we can taught really at the very beginning of the education of students. It seems to me that this layer, it's something that we often add at the end. I mean, because actually many of you, of course, and some of us have been now very much involved in this discussion about labor. But when it comes to the very introduction of architecture, I mean, also I look back to my own experience, somehow anything related to these issues is invisible. We almost, I don't have anything against the artistic approach to architecture. And of course, that's what maybe has also inspired many of us to engage with architecture. But there is a point where this kind of artistic approach obliterates and completely, let's say, hide the fact that whatever we draw has actually eventually might have consequences for very large networks of people and involved in the realization of architecture. So there is certainly no doubt that at this point there are incredible experiences. I want to mention not only actually, of course, the work that you have seen today, but also the work that Peggy Deemer has done with the architectural lobby. For me, there is no doubt that we are in a moment where there is a growing awareness about these issues. And of course, they are very complex, so it takes some time to really embrace and map the complexity. But the big challenge is really how we introduce this discussion to, as Kadambari said before, at the very beginning of learning architecture. And I think that's for me the biggest challenge, because I mean, when I teach to especially like in my first year survey of architectural history, it's very difficult to find architectural survey that also by very recent ones that pay any attention to the question of building. I mean, architecture is just taught as a sequence of shapes of very interesting, let's say, forms. But when it comes to really how these things were materialized, you have to go to very specialized literature by archaeologists, by historians, which of course is often very difficult to access by people who are starting their education as architects. So I think that perhaps the spirit of the symposium for me was really in the vein not to immediately produce a very specialized and precise, let's say, knowledge about these issues, but how we can somehow introduce this discussion and knowledge to all the, let's say, levels of architectural education.
There's Juliette actually with her hand raised for a while, and also Philip wanted to ask a question.
Please take the floor. Yes, you have to unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you so much for such an interesting day. I wanted to ask, to follow on actually from what you were just saying, Pia Vittoria, to the final speaker. I think it was interesting to have the advocacy framed by the question, who builds your architecture? But the your could be both authorship and ownership. And I think it's so difficult to focus on the labor with the architect as the intermediary, but really the projects are often initiated by either the owner of the site or as a conventional client, but more often than not, investment seen as in that way. And I think, the way that today's symposium was framed with talking about capitalism, maybe that's too large a question, but to just go back to what Kadambari was saying about the way that she advocates or describes her advocacy through drawing, and what kind of shape or form an advocacy might also be taking that would maybe address the capitalist machine more directly, or even specific owners of sites like the site in Qatar that was referred to earlier. So I just wondered if maybe she could talk a little bit about that, and whether any of her exhibition programming has, addressed that sector of the world as much as it obviously addresses the architecture community specifically.
Sure, thank you for that question. I think you are precisely very right that we need to educate the clients and investors as much as we educate ourselves. And so that, and of course, that's a huge challenge for sure. But I think that as you're saying, that we need to educate ourselves also the terms of the political economy that's in play. I think that conversation maybe does go back to the education, our own education as architects a bit, or let's say our collaborations with experts who do understand, things about political economy and where the pressure points are for that. And I do think that, our group, there are other collectives like the climate activism was mentioned before by Christine, but for sure the Gulf Labor Artists Group, when they worked with the Guggenheim Museum, they did a lot of activism that reached the board of the Guggenheim Museum, and they had these discussions with the board about, what should be done if the Guggenheim Museum was built in Qatar, in Abu Dhabi, and what sort of conditions, how can, and the board, from what I understand, was at least interested in hearing from what they had to say. But it took a lot of activism, including protests in the Guggenheim Museum in New York, et cetera, that, that produced those pressure points. And I do think that, we, even as, we also encountered that a little bit in the Art Institute of Chicago, where I showed you the kind of interface we were trying to track the one building element and all the consultants involved and what we could or couldn't find. And we really wanted to do actually the skylight in the museum itself. If we could track the building of, that skylight and what was involved, etc. And again, we faced resistance in the name of security, that they didn't want these drawings of their skylight on the wall. Although I do think that was, that was just a way to not us,
deflect from that.
Yeah, exactly.
I just wonder as well whether you think there's any mileage in the equivalent of, say, for example, benchmarks for fair trade or ethical investment, and whether also the client, on this client side, whether there's a sort of shorthand that could be applied that would allow for, it's like you've described, it's obviously incredibly thorny and complex, but whether there's mileage or scope for investing in building and an ethical production of building being seen in the way that companies or other sectors like investing in arms or in oil companies has been, there's been like really high profile divestment from universities, investment funds away from those areas, and whether you think there's any way that construction companies can achieve a sort of fair trade or equivalent mark that would allow for that to be managed in a way as sort of an investment level, or whether actually it's just so incredibly complex with all the different parts as well as the labour conditions to be factored in that there would never be any sort of shorthand available.
Yeah, I do think that there's some models that we can look at. The electronics industry and the garment industry, was really pushed, I think, in some of these fair trade, when there was that fire environment. But I do think that ultimately they are for sure models in terms of pressure points, but I still worry a little bit about how much of that really in the end made a difference for the workers, and of course it's a branding strategy for sure. It helps them, but it also, in some cases, I think, as perhaps you're bringing up, it might make the quote unquote business sense also to, invest in this kind of, I don't know, in these kind of conditions, right? To improve them. And often I think that it's really because really it's in these large projects, the ideas around workers' housings, etc. In the end, if you look at all the kind of finance and economics of it, it's not a huge amount, I think, in some cases to really start making even small differences. But I think this is where we need a lot of cultural work, like really cultural, kind of awareness that produces these kind of pressure points.
Thanks.
So maybe we have time for one more question from the audience. Well, if not, actually, maybe I just make a final question, comment. I mean, one of the things that for me has emerged from several presentations is that when it comes to the question of labor and building, a very important, let's say, tool that actually was the protagonist of Federico's and Hugh's presentation is the spreadsheet. I mean, I thought that the presentation of Federico, where he actually showed the wage log as the centerpiece of the whole process through which this architectural materials was very interesting. And I remember actually Jeremy Thiel, a very important eminent scholar actually from UK, wrote somewhere, I think in his book, maybe Architecture Depends, that architects always like to fantasize about buildings and forms, but at the end, actually, everything comes down to the spreadsheet, where everything is organized in a way that you can then communicate and reify basically the design to this kind of networks of production. And of course, he argued that almost to criticize the idea of profession invested in form making and in the appearance of architecture, and somehow in a way this is really reflects also in the expectations we have as architects. I mean, when we practice, we all would like just to design things to with pencil, but often our work is actually works through these spreadsheets, works through this these tabulations or this kind of ways in which we produce architecture. And I think what I really appreciate about some of your presentations, and also Kadi's and Hugh, but everybody's, is how, both as a critical tool, but also as a way to practice architecture, perhaps the spreadsheet could be an incredible side of, to use the bad word, creativity. I mean, how sometimes those roles in the architectural profession that we think are purely managerial and administrative can really give us agency. Once actually we embrace these roles in a critical way, not of course just to perpetrate those things that these things are meant to maintain. So I think this is for me really an invitation for us as architects and students of architecture to imagine that also this very boring, let's say, between quote unquote, of course, aspects of architecture can be incredibly powerful in somehow slightly change the way in which we think and produce architecture. I think that was for me one of the most important highlights of also the conversation we had today. I don't know if you want to reply to this remark, or you are completely exhausted.
I'll just make one comment also based on some of the things that Paolo mentioned earlier today. From a contemporary standpoint, in terms of teaching and how we deal with things that are part of this kind of managerial aesthetic, those kind of things exist, and they exist in droves. They're buried and configured differently in the media systems that we use. Historically, at least in my own kind of limited experience with the subjects that I've studied, they were the first thing to go in the fireplace. And so when you find one, it feels rare, or it feels, and so there's that kind of element. I don't think they're going to be rare because they aren't rare right now. They're actually probably, and when you look at the kind of output that we're doing professionally, like you said, they exist at scales that are overwhelming even.
Yeah.
The problem is that normally I say that you learn more about building if you go to a Docomomo conference than if you go to an architectural conference, because in contemporary architecture, all the data that really matter in order to understand the configuration of a building are carefully taken out of removed of the scene for matters of confidentiality, for all sorts of things. The problem is that it's very, very difficult to study contemporary architecture and to analyze the building fabric for what it is, rather than what it means. We're still looking at, we try to interpret buildings in ways that are sort of truncated, because we don't have the documentation that really matters. I mean, I could give you the percentage of the bills that a very, very famous firm gets on a very famous project, and that percentage is going to be halved by the monies given to other companies that don't actually appear in those projects. So they're in a political economy of the project, which takes the project to a completely different place. I'm talking about medium, large projects, and they're not part of the documentation that one looks at or can actually get close to. And that is the problem, that contemporary architecture is very, very difficult to approach, not necessarily from a scholarly point of view, but also from a pedagogical point of view. And I'm sure you know about all the various attempts that have been made over the last 20 years to actually look at buildings as case studies. In a course of technology, you can actually go to any architectural firm and ask them to give you the documentation of a famous building, of a canonical building, because you can even get close to it with a 10-foot pole. And that is the real problem, that the system doesn't allow architecture, conception, and materialization to come together, because very often they're not the same thing.
Yeah, this is exactly a bit was very much one of the main provocation of the symposium, to really argue that building has become more and more opaque in the discussion of architecture. I know that, we are actually really on time today. I don't know why. I mean, it's rarely happening in a symposium of these proportions. I understand that we might be starting the kind of Zoom fatigue, so I would like to perhaps conclude this also afternoon session, but also conclude the whole symposium. I know that there are many more questions, but I'm sure that we will find ways in which this conversation will continue. I have to say I'm extremely, really happy and grateful for your incredible contributions. This has been, I really want to say it without any sense of rhetoric, one of the best intellectual experience I have lately. I mean, to listen to these incredible dense presentations that to me actually really made the effort to introduce us to something old and new at the same time. Old because, of course, building is the fundamental theme of architecture, but also new because I think building has to become, again, the main focus of architecture. Not building, of course, as I said before, not as an object, but as a process that involve people, involve workers, from design to construction. So it's a very strange way to conclude a strange thing to conclude a symposium on Zoom, because everything is very silent. So you can't hear anything like clapping or these kind of things that usually give a kind of feeling of conclusion. But I just want to say thank you, and thanks a lot for those who actually have been with us. We have a really large number of people following us through the day. I'm really grateful to all of you, and especially to the speakers, of course. Thank you so much, and I really hope to see you soon and to be with you actually also in presence, as we now say with the COVID jargon. But anyway, I think the presence of you was very strong in your contributions. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much to all of you.